Chuck Norris stood at the front of the first-class check-in line at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, calm as a mountain in a storm. Around him, well-heeled travelers buzzed with urgency, designer luggage in tow, phones glued to their ears. But Chuck. He didn't move with the crowd. He didn't need to. A few feet away, Bradford Sterling watched him like a predator sizing up prey. Bradford's suit was tailored within an inch of its life, his watch sparkled under the airport lights, and his ego filled the room before he did. His expression twisted with disdain the second his eyes locked on Chuck. What happened next would shake every soul on that flight, and force Bradford to question everything he thought he knew. But before we dive into this unbelievable showdown, tell us, where are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story. Even wilder. Back to the terminal, chaos buzzed like electricity, wheels clattered on tile, gate announcements blared, people moved fast. Yet there, standing still like a man out of time, was Chuck Norris. Worn denim jacket. Faded jeans. Boots that had walked through more than just cities. Nothing flashy. No designer logos. But something about him made people take a second glance. He carried a quiet intensity, the kind you don't notice right away, but once you do, you can't look away. Everyone around him seemed to be chasing something. Chuck. He was just there. Present. Still. He didn't flinch when people stared. Didn't react to the subtle scoffs. That's when Bradford Sterling, polished and impatient, finally snapped. First class, huh? He sneered, flashing a condescending grin. Guess they'll let just about anyone in these days. Chuck turned. His expression didn't shift. His voice was steady. Worlds full of surprises. Bradford wasn't expecting that. He was fishing for a reaction, something to confirm his bias. But Chuck didn't bite. Silence. Poised. Unbothered. Bradford pushed again. No offense, but you don't really look like the first-class type. He chuckled dryly. Not every day you see someone that, laid back up here. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. The first-class line began to move. Chuck didn't dignify the comment with a response. He just stepped forward, boarding pass in hand, walking like a man with nothing to prove. Bradford strutted past the gate like he owned the plane. Chuck followed, same even pace. Calm as ever. But fate wasn't done with them yet. Bradford reached his seat and blinked. Checked his ticket. Then looked again. There, right beside him, settling in without a trace of irony, was Chuck Norris. You've got to be kidding me, Bradford muttered, dropping into his seat with a theatrical sigh. Chuck looked over and gave a small nod. Looks like we're traveling together. Bradford crossed his arms, his jaw tight. It wasn't just that he was seated next to Chuck. It was that the man he had just mocked was now sharing the same luxury space. And somehow, that rattled him. Still trying to reclaim control, Bradford turned, voice casual but sharp. So, what do you do for a living? Chuck, calmly placing his bag under the seat, replied, I teach self-reliance. Bradford raised a brow. A smirk danced on his lips. Ah. Motivational speaker? Chuck gave the faintest shrug. Something like that. Bradford laughed, shaking his head. Everyone's always chasing something, huh? But let's face it, some places just aren't meant for everyone. First class being one of them. Chuck looked at him, unblinking. I believe everyone ends up exactly where they're meant to be. Bradford scoffed. Cute. But this isn't a feel-good movie. This is real life. Chuck turned to the window, unfazed. But Bradford wasn't done. He leaned in, voice dropping. You might be sitting here now, but there are things money can't buy. And some people. They'll never really belong. Chuck met his gaze, eyes steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. But something in his silence landed heavier than any insult. Bradford pulled back, smug again. He thought he'd won. He had no idea how wrong he was. As the plane soared into the clouds, the battle of words was only beginning. Sometimes the simplest things are the most powerful, Chuck said, his voice steady. Bradford's eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's what people say when they've convinced themselves they're okay with average. Some of us are built for more, for the very best. Chuck didn't flinch. He took a sip from his drink, refusing to rise to the bait. Around them, a few heads turned. The tension was becoming palpable, but Chuck's calm presence kept the crowd at bay. Maybe the best looks different for everyone, Chuck replied, his voice cool and measured. Bradford inhaled deeply, fighting the urge to lash out. He wanted control. He wanted to win this silent war of words. Or maybe, he said, barely masking the venom in his tone, some people talk like that because they've never tasted what truly matters. Some things are simply out of reach for the mediocre. A flight attendant glanced their way, sensing trouble. But one look at Chuck's composed face told her, he had it under control. Could be, Chuck murmured, turning his gaze to the window. But Bradford wasn't finished. Not even close. He wasn't after peace, he wanted a reaction, something to prove he was in control. Yet the more Chuck resisted, the more it gnawed at him. Others on the plane began to notice, not just Bradford's arrogance, but the contrast between his inflated ego and Chuck's quiet strength. And then, Bradford made a mistake. A big one. He raised his glass with theatrical flair and sneered, you know, life is just like flying first class. You hustle, you earn it, and then you enjoy the view. But some people, well, they're just here on a lucky coin toss. Chuck set his water down slowly and turned to face him fully. His voice dropped, low and resolute. Luck or hustle, we all hit the same runway when we land. Isn't that right? Now the cabin was watching. Even those pretending not to listen were hanging on every word. Bradford's forced smile faltered. Chuck's quiet confidence was starting to rattle him. I wouldn't say that, Bradford pushed back. Some of us operate on a higher level. Most people don't even grasp what this life really means. Chuck leaned in just a little, not threatening, but commanding. What it means, he said, motioning gently to the elegant cabin around them, isn't about what you own. It's how you treat the people around you. A hush fell. A few passengers exchanged knowing glances. Others cast subtle glances of disapproval toward Bradford. He laughed, awkward and defensive. That's rich, coming from you. What are you, some kind of first-class philosopher? Maybe start a podcast. Chuck didn't answer. He simply turned away, the silence landing harder than any comeback. The crowd's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. Whispers spread. A few faces lit with recognition. Someone had seen Chuck before, they knew him. And Bradford could feel it. The shift. Eyes were no longer admiring, they were judging. He tried to straighten up, to reclaim control, but the moment had slipped. Trying to claw back ground, he leaned forward. Funny thing, he said, voice sharp. It's always the ones with nothing to show who preach about humility and simplicity. Ever notice that? Chuck didn't blink. And I've noticed it's the ones who brag the loudest who feel the emptiest. It hit like a stone in still water. Bradford opened his mouth, but the words got stuck. Around them, the cabin seemed to lean in. Bradford stammered, look, no offense, but the world is a competition. If you don't show off what you've got, no one will notice you. Chuck leaned back, eyes never leaving him. Maybe. Or maybe real success doesn't need a spotlight. It carries its own weight. The mood in the cabin shifted again. Disapproval toward Bradford was growing. He could see it, feel it. His confidence was cracking, and the crowd wasn't on his side. But he wasn't ready to retreat. Not yet. He fired off one more jab. Sounds nice. But that kind of cheap philosophy won't get you far. The world isn't built like that. Chuck's tone didn't change. Still calm. Still in control. The world is built on people, Bradford. And in the end, how you treat them is what defines you. Bradford was unraveling. The stares around him weren't admiration, they were condemnation. His dominance had crumbled, and the man across from him, the one he tried to mock, hadn't even raised his voice. Chuck looked at him one final time. Then, with quiet authority, he broke the silence, just enough to finish the moment with truth that cut deeper than any insult. You know, Bradford, Chuck began, his voice calm but edged with something deeper. I get it. The competition, the pressure. But sometimes, that constant urge to prove yourself, it comes from something else. Something internal. Bradford arched a brow, unsure if he was being challenged or psychoanalyzed. Inner insecurity, he scoffed, letting out a sharp laugh. Where the hell did you get that idea? You couldn't be more wrong. Chuck gave a faint smile. Maybe. But I've met people who chased status their whole lives, flashy wins, loud success, only to realize they were patching up a hole inside they never wanted to face. That hit something. Bradford didn't speak. He just fiddled with his watch, eyes down, as if searching for an escape in the ticking seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was stiff. Defensive. That's not me. I've earned every damn thing I have. And I sure don't need some stranger telling me how to live. Chuck nodded slowly, unbothered. He held Bradford's gaze. I'm not saying you didn't work for it. I'm saying sometimes we get so obsessed with showing the world what we've done, we forget to ask who we are without all of it. Bradford's jaw tensed. The question rattled something loose, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not out loud. Who are we? He snapped. We are what we build. Without it, we're nothing. Chuck leaned in, calm as ever. I don't think so. We're defined by what we give, not what we stack. And at the end of the day, what we show the world means a lot less than what we carry inside. He tapped his chest, and for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to pause with the weight of those words. A few passengers nodded, quietly affected. Bradford, on the other hand, looked like a man barely holding his grip. That's easy for you to say, he barked, starting to rise from his seat. You don't know a damn thing about me. You don't know what I've had to claw through just to get here. Chuck didn't flinch. You're right. I don't know your story. But I don't have to. Because when someone needs to shout about their success, it usually means they're hiding something else. Fear. Insecurity. Loneliness. The words landed like a gut punch. Bradford froze. His face flushed red, whether from rage or shame, no one could tell. His fists clenched tight. His breathing grew sharp. And then, he snapped. He surged to his feet, knocking over his empty champagne glass with a crash that silenced the entire cabin. You think you're better than me? He shouted, voice shaking the air. You sit there with your little phrases, acting like you've got all the answers, but you know nothing about the real world. The cabin was dead silent now. Even the hum of the engines felt muted. A flight attendant rushed over, trying to ease the tension. But Chuck didn't move. He just watched, calmly, waiting for Bradford to finish. And when he did, Chuck spoke, low and steady. I never said I was better than you, Bradford. But maybe it's time to ask yourself what really matters. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. That was the blow that broke him. Bradford collapsed back into his seat, chest heaving, eyes darting away. He didn't respond. Couldn't. Chuck's words rang in his mind like an echo he couldn't escape. For the first time in years, he felt completely exposed. But what Bradford didn't know, was that the worst moment of the flight hadn't even happened yet. The rest of the journey passed under a tense hush. Bradford kept his eyes fixed forward, never once glancing at Chuck. It was clear something had shifted. Deeply. Chuck, meanwhile, looked as relaxed as ever. Like the storm had never even touched him. Later, the flight attendant returned with a polite smile, interrupting the stillness. "Mr. Norris," she said, her voice warm and clear, "the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Atlanta is confirmed. And he sends his regards." That name, Norris, rolled through the cabin like a lightning strike. Eyes widened. A murmur stirred. And across the aisle, Bradford went still. "Norris," he repeated under his breath, voice barely audible. "Chuck." "Norris." Chuck nodded, thanking the attendant without acknowledging the stir behind him. Then he turned, just slightly, and caught Bradford's stunned expression. The look of a man who just realized who he'd been talking to. "Is there a problem, Bradford?" Chuck asked, his tone as calm as ever. Bradford opened his mouth. No sound came out. Around them, passengers stared. Some curious. Others judging. Bradford could feel the weight of their eyes. He slumped in his seat, trying to disappear. I didn't know," he mumbled. "You didn't say who you were." "I had no idea." Chuck's voice stayed even, but there was steel in it now. "That's because it wasn't necessary. My name doesn't change the truth." Bradford sat in silence. Beaten not by Chuck, but by his own reflection. And he still had no idea that the final blow was just around the corner. He had no idea who he was talking to. Chuck let out a quiet sigh, his tone calm but firm. "Bradford, it doesn't matter who I am. The truth doesn't gain weight because of the speaker. It gains power by how it's lived. How we treat people, that's what defines us." The words hit Bradford like a punch to the gut. For once, he was speechless. Around him, the once indifferent passengers now stared silently, their eyes locked on him. The self-assured smirk he'd worn at the beginning of the flight had vanished. Replaced by something much heavier, shame. Chuck leaned back, voice steady and composed. "Life is hard enough, Bradford. What we don't need, are people tearing others down just to feel taller." Bradford gave a slow nod, his eyes down, face flushed. Something was shifting inside him. He wasn't just embarrassed, he'd been stripped bare by the truth. And for the first time in a long while, he was really listening. As Chuck turned his focus back to his book, the cabin fell into silence again. But in Bradford's mind, the noise was deafening. Every word Chuck had spoken echoed louder than the last. He stared at his hands, the very ones he had used to gesture with superiority earlier. Now they just trembled. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about being right. He was thinking about how wrong he'd been. How often he'd judged people without knowing anything about them. "Maybe he's right," he muttered under his breath, not even realizing the words had slipped out. He glanced at Chuck, calm, composed, reading quietly like none of it ever happened. And that only deepened the impact. Chuck hadn't needed to prove anything. He didn't raise his voice. He let his actions speak. As the plane began its descent, Bradford finally summoned the nerve to say something. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, not meeting Chuck's eyes. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I was. I acted like a fool." Chuck looked over, serene as ever. He let the moment settle before answering. "I appreciate that. But more than the apology, I hope you grow from this." Bradford nodded again, this time with meaning. Chuck added, "The things we chase in others, we often lack in ourselves. I hope you find what truly matters." There was no follow-up. No lecture. Just truth, and the kind that stays with you long after it's spoken. When they landed, Bradford stepped off the plane and turned, watching Chuck walk away through the terminal. A small group of fans greeted him, and Chuck responded with warmth, not ego. There was no performance, no show. Just kindness. Bradford looked down at his own hands once more. The same hands that had once pointed, gestured, dismissed others, now clenched quietly. He knew something had to change. Chuck's words weren't just a passing conversation, they were a wake-up call. A quiet reminder that status means nothing if you lack decency. And maybe, just maybe, this meeting wasn't random. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. In the end, we're all defined by our choices, not our titles, not our wealth, but by the way we treat the world around us. Are we living to impress others? Or are we trying to become someone better? Chuck's message is clear: true success isn't about accolades. It's about the legacy you leave in the hearts of others. And when you find yourself judging, or battling for ego, pause. Ask yourself, will this make me better, or just louder? Respect. Humility. They never go out of style. If this story moved you, there are many more waiting, stories of courage, kindness, and second chances. Tap the screen to explore them all.